Hey guys, tonight we're heading somewhere old, really old. Back about 2,000 years, give or take a few emperors and several catastrophic political decisions. So if you're listening in bed, maybe dim the lights a little. Get comfortable. Let your brain slowly power down like an ancient Roman bathhouse after closing time. Because tonight, we're gently wandering through daily life in the Roman Empire. Not the dramatic version with screaming gladiators and flaming cities. Hollywood already did that part, several times, and usually with far too many British accents. Instead, we're going to look at the quieter side of the empire, the sleepy side, the everyday side, the part where ordinary Romans wake up, complain about taxes, gossip about emperors, eat suspicious bread, and try not to get trampled by carts in crowded streets. And occasionally, we'll float past an emperor or two, because the Roman Empire had plenty of those. Some brilliant, some disastrous, and some who probably should not have been left alone with the imperial crown, or really any responsibility at all. But we'll keep things calm tonight. Slow, gentle. So take a breath and let's drift back to the ancient world. Picture the city of Rome around the 1st or 2nd century AD. At this point, the empire is enormous. It stretches from rainy Britain all the way to the deserts of the Middle East, North Africa, Spain, Greece, Egypt. All connected, more or less, by roads that Roman engineers built with obsessive dedication and a lot of very tired laborers. And right at the center of it all is Rome itself, a massive city by ancient standards. Estimates suggest somewhere between 800,000 and maybe even 1 million people lived there at its peak, which is a lot. Especially when you remember that modern plumbing, sanitation, and basic urban planning were still very much in the experimental phase. So yes, Rome was impressive, but it was also crowded, noisy, occasionally smelly, and full of people trying to survive in the biggest city the ancient world had ever seen. Let's start with the morning, because mornings in Rome began early, partly because people had things to do, and partly because there were no streetlights, which meant once the sun went down, life got a lot more inconvenient. So as the sun rises over the hills surrounding Rome, the city slowly wakes up. Shops open their shutters, vendors begin setting up stalls, and somewhere in the distance, a donkey is probably refusing to cooperate with a cart driver, which was basically the universal soundtrack of ancient urban life. Now, if you were wealthy, mornings looked pretty nice. You might wake up in a comfortable house called a domus. These were the homes of the Roman elite. Inside, you'd find an open courtyard, a small garden, maybe some decorative fountains if the owner was feeling fancy, and plenty of colorful wall paintings. Romans absolutely loved wall paintings. Scenes of gardens, landscapes, mythology. Occasionally some very confident portraits of the homeowner looking far more heroic than they probably were in real life. Because if you're going to decorate your house, why not portray yourself like a semi-divine hero while you're at it? Confidence was never a problem for Roman aristocrats. But most Romans did not live like this, not even close. Instead, they lived in apartment buildings called insulae, and if that word sounds slightly ominous, that's because it kind of was. These buildings could be several stories tall, sometimes 6 or 7 floors, which sounds impressive until you remember that Roman building regulations were, let's say, flexible. Construction quality varied wildly. Some buildings were sturdy, others were basically stacked bricks held together by optimism and questionable engineering decisions. Collapses were not exactly rare. Fires were also a constant risk. Rome, after all, was mostly wood and brick, packed tightly together, filled with cooking fires and oil lamps. So yes, insurance companies would have had a very stressful time in ancient Rome. Inside an insula apartment, space was limited, really limited. A small room or two at most, often shared by an entire family. And if your apartment was higher up in the building, congratulations, you also got the privilege of climbing several flights of stairs every single day, because elevators were still about 1,800 years away from being invented. And unfortunately, water usually didn't reach the upper floors either, which meant residents had to carry water upstairs themselves. Imagine hauling buckets up 5 flights of stairs every morning. Suddenly, modern plumbing starts to feel pretty magical. Now, once people were awake and moving around, the streets of Rome became busy very quickly. In fact, daytime traffic in Rome was so chaotic that carts were often banned during daylight hours. Yes, really. Most wheeled traffic had to move through the city at night, which meant that if you were trying to sleep in Rome, you were probably listening to the constant rumble of cartwheels on stone streets, all night long. Ancient insomnia courtesy of Roman logistics. During the day, the streets were filled with pedestrians, merchants shouting about their products, customers bargaining over prices, children running around, dogs wandering through the crowd hoping someone drops a piece of bread. And somewhere, there's always a philosopher giving an unsolicited lecture about the meaning of life, because ancient cities were surprisingly philosophical places. If you stood still long enough, someone would eventually start explaining the universe to you, often at great length. Markets were everywhere. Romans bought most of their food fresh each day. Bread was a staple. Bread and more bread. Wheat was so important that the Roman government actually provided free or subsidized grain to many citizens. This system was called the grain dole, basically an early welfare program designed to keep the urban population fed and, perhaps more importantly, calm, because hungry citizens tend to become politically enthusiastic, and Roman leaders preferred their citizens slightly less enthusiastic about revolutions. Bakeries were common, and they worked constantly. Large stone mills ground grain into flour, usually powered by donkeys or... Archaeologists studying the buried city of Pompeii have actually found preserved loaves of Roman bread, still sitting in ovens when the volcanic eruption of Mount Vesuvius froze the city in time, which is both fascinating and a little eerie. 2,000 years later, and the bread is still there, just slightly overbaked. Speaking of Pompeii, it's one of the best windows we have into Roman daily life. Before the eruption in 79 AD, Pompeii was a busy town near the Bay of Naples, full of shops, taverns, houses, temples, and an impressive number of snack bars. Yes, ancient Romans loved fast food. Small street-side counters sold hot food to passers-by, stews, bread, wine. Because cooking at home wasn't always practical, especially for people living in cramped apartments, so grabbing a quick meal from a local vendor was extremely common. Basically, the ancient version of grabbing takeout on your way home from work, except with more olives. Wine, of course, was everywhere. Romans drink a lot of wine, but usually diluted with water. Straight wine was considered a bit barbaric, something foreigners did. Civilized Romans mixed it with water and sometimes added herbs or honey, which probably made the taste interesting. Let's just say Roman wine recipes would definitely surprise a modern sommelier. As the day continues, many Romans head toward one of the most famous social institutions in the empire, the baths. Public bathhouses were absolutely central to Roman life. They weren't just for cleaning yourself, they were social centers, meeting places, exercise facilities, libraries, conversation hubs. Basically, the ancient Roman version of a gym, spa, and coffee shop all combined into one enormous complex. And they were everywhere. Even small towns often had baths, but the biggest ones in Rome were enormous. The baths of Caracalla, for example, covered several city blocks. Inside, you'd find hot rooms, warm rooms, cold plunge pools, massage areas, and large open courtyards for exercise. Thousands of people could visit every day, and the entry fee was usually very cheap, sometimes even free. Roman emperors loved funding public baths. It made them look generous, and if there's one thing Roman politics thrived on, it was dramatic public generosity, preferably with giant buildings attached. So imagine walking into one of these bath complexes. Steam rising from warm pools, people chatting about politics, others arguing about chariot races, some quietly relaxing after a long day. It's noisy, but in a relaxed way. The background hum of everyday life. And somewhere nearby, someone is definitely gossiping about the emperor, because Romans loved political gossip, and emperors gave them plenty to talk about. But don't worry, we'll drift into imperial drama a little later. Slowly, very slowly. For now, we'll just sit here in the warm bathhouse air, listening to the quiet murmur of ancient Rome. And in the next part, we'll wander deeper into Roman society, meeting soldiers, slaves, senators, and a few emperors who probably should have taken more relaxing baths and fewer disastrous political decisions. So take a breath. Let the sounds of the ancient city fade into the background, and we'll continue our slow walk through the Roman world in part 2. All right, let's gently continue our slow walk through the ancient world. If you're still listening, hopefully you're comfortable, maybe the lights are low, maybe the room is quiet, and your brain is slowly drifting somewhere between curiosity and sleep. Perfect, because the Roman Empire is a surprisingly good place for that kind of wandering. We left off in a Roman bathhouse, steam floating lazily through the air, citizens chatting about chariot races and political gossip. And honestly, that's not a bad place to start understanding Roman life, because Romans loved routine. Baths in the afternoon, food from the market, complaints about politics. It's all very familiar, actually. Human nature has not changed that much in 2,000 years. The clothing is different, the transportation is worse, the plumbing is occasionally questionable, but people themselves, pretty recognizable. Let's step outside the baths for a moment and wander back into the streets of Rome, because if the baths were relaxing, the streets were something else entirely. Busy, crowded, loud, and occasionally chaotic in ways that modern city planners would absolutely lose sleep over. Imagine narrow streets filled with people moving in every direction, merchants shouting prices, street performers trying to earn a few coins, beggars asking for help, dogs wandering around like they owned the place, which, to be fair, they kind of did, and somewhere in the crowd, a politician's assistant is probably whispering campaign promises to anyone willing to listen. Because yes, even in ancient Rome, politics was everywhere. Roman citizens voted in assemblies and elections, especially during the earlier periods of the empire. Campaign posters were painted directly onto walls. Archaeologists studying Pompeii have found hundreds of these messages. Things like, "Vote for Lucius Popedius Sabinus, an honest man," or the classic, "The bakers support Marcus for office," which honestly sounds very similar to modern politics, just with more plaster walls and fewer television commercials. Now, as we wander down the street, you might notice something interesting. Shops are everywhere, and most of them are tiny. A typical Roman shop was basically a single room opening directly onto the street. The owner would stand behind a counter while customers gathered outside. Inside, you might find bread, olives, wine, clothing, oil lamps, jewelry, or occasionally something slightly more exotic, depending on the trader's connections. Because one thing the Roman Empire did incredibly well was trade. The empire stretched across 3 continents, and goods flowed constantly between regions. Grain from Egypt, olive oil from Spain, wine from Gaul, marble from Greece, spices from far beyond the eastern borders. Roman markets were full of things from all over the known world, which must have been very exciting and occasionally very confusing for the average shopper. Where exactly did this pepper come from? Somewhere east of here. Good enough. And then, of course, there were taverns. Roman taverns were lively places. People gathered there to eat simple meals, drink wine, and argue about whatever topic happened to be popular that week. Sports were always a safe bet, especially chariot racing. If you lived in Rome, chances are you had a favorite racing team: the Reds, the Blues, the Greens, or the Whites. These teams competed in the massive stadium known as the Circus Maximus, and Roman fans took this competition seriously. We're talking passionate arguments, heated rivalries, and occasionally full-scale riots, all over which group of horses could run. The Circus Maximus itself was enormous. It could hold well over 150,000 spectators, possibly even more, which makes it one of the largest sports venues in history. Picture a giant oval stadium filled with cheering crowds, chariots racing around tight corners, dust flying everywhere, and spectators screaming for their favorite drivers. For many Romans, this was the highlight of the week, a chance to escape daily problems and watch something thrilling. Of course, we're trying to keep things calm tonight, so we won't linger too long in the roaring crowd. Instead, let's quietly slip away and head toward another important part of Roman society: the army. Because the Roman Empire didn't become enormous by accident. It required an incredibly disciplined military. Roman soldiers were famous for their organization, training, and stubborn determination. A typical Roman legionary served for about 20 years. 20, which is a long time to spend marching across dusty roads wearing heavy armor. But the reward at the end was worth it: land, money, and sometimes Roman citizenship. So many young men joined the army hoping to build a better future, though the job itself was not exactly relaxing. Roman soldiers spent much of their time building things: roads, fortifications, bridges, camps. The Roman army might have been the most productive construction company in ancient history, which is slightly ironic. You join the army expecting glorious battles, and instead you're handed a shovel. Congratulations, soldier! Today you will be digging a trench. Ancient military glamour at its finest. Roman forts could be found all over the empire, from the deserts of Syria to the chilly northern frontier of Britannia. One of the most famous defensive structures built by Roman soldiers was Hadrian's Wall, a massive wall stretching across northern Britain, ordered by the Emperor Hadrian in the 2nd century. Its purpose was simple: keep things under control, or at least try to. Beyond the wall lived various tribes who were not particularly interested in Roman rule, so the wall acted as a border and a reminder that the empire preferred its neighbors slightly farther away. Back in Rome itself, soldiers were also present, especially the emperor's personal guards, the Praetorian Guard. Now, on paper, the Praetorians existed to protect the emperor. In reality, they occasionally protected the emperor, replaced the emperor, or quietly removed the emperor depending on how things were going that week. They were powerful, very powerful, and Roman emperors learned quickly that keeping the Praetorian Guard happy was a very good idea, preferably with money, lots of money. Because if history teaches us anything, it's that armed bodyguards with political influence tend to develop strong opinions about leadership. Speaking of emperors, let's briefly drift toward one of the more famous rulers of the early empire. The very first one, actually, Augustus. Originally known as Octavian, he rose to power after a long series of civil wars that effectively ended the Roman Republic. And to his credit, Augustus was remarkably careful. He didn't call himself a king. Romans hated kings. Instead, he used softer titles: first citizen, princeps. Very humble sounding, very modest. Meanwhile, he quietly controlled the entire government, which, politically speaking, was a very smooth move. Under Augustus, the empire entered a long period of relative stability known as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. This era lasted roughly 2 centuries. Trade flourished, cities expanded, road networks connected distant provinces, and everyday life across much of the empire became surprisingly stable. Of course, peace is a relative term. There were still rebellions, still wars on distant frontiers, but compared to the chaos before Augustus, things were pretty calm, and Romans appreciated that, because stability meant food in the markets, safe roads, and fewer armies marching through your neighborhood. Always a plus. As evening slowly approaches in Rome, the city begins to change. Shops close, crowds thin out, oil lamps flicker to life in windows. Families gather for dinner, which for wealthier Romans could be a surprisingly elaborate affair. Formal dinners often involved reclining on couches around a low table. Guests would eat several courses while discussing philosophy, politics, or the latest imperial scandal, because nothing spices up dinner conversation quite like rumors about the emperor. Meanwhile, ordinary Romans might enjoy a simpler meal: bread, vegetables, cheese, maybe some fish if they were lucky. Still filling, still satisfying after a long day. And as night settles over the city, the noise slowly fades. Except for one thing. Remember those carts that weren't allowed during the day? Well, now it's their time to shine. The rumble of wheels returns. Merchants transporting goods, supplies moving through narrow streets, the steady clatter of wooden carts over stone. Ancient nighttime traffic. Not exactly the most peaceful lullaby, but Romans were used to it. They had no choice. And with that quiet rhythm echoing through the dark streets of Rome, we'll slowly drift into the next part of our journey. Because next, we'll take a closer look at the people who made Roman society run. Slaves, freedmen, merchants, and the occasional dramatic Roman aristocrats who believed their family tree was basically the center of the universe, which, to be fair, some of them tried very hard to prove. So relax, take a slow breath, and we'll continue our gentle walk through the Roman world in Part 3. Part 3. Slaves, freedmen, and the surprisingly complicated social ladder. All right, let's continue our quiet little stroll through the ancient world. By now, the sun has set over the rooftops of Rome. Oil lamps flicker softly in windows. Somewhere down the street, a tavern is still serving wine, and a few tired merchants are finally closing their stalls. The great city of the Roman Empire never truly sleeps, but it definitely slows down. Which makes this a good moment to talk about the people who actually kept Roman society running. Because when most people imagine ancient Rome, they picture emperors, senators, or gladiators. Very dramatic, very cinematic. But the vast majority of Romans were none of those things. They were workers, shopkeepers, servants, farmers, laborers, and, quite often, slaves. Now, slavery in the Roman world was extremely common. In fact, it was one of the foundations of the entire economy. Large households had slaves, farms had slaves, mines had slaves, government offices had slaves, even wealthy slaves sometimes had slaves, which is a slightly confusing hierarchy if you stop to think about it too long. But that was Roman society for you. Complicated. Most slaves came from conquered territories. Whenever Roman armies expanded the empire, prisoners of war were often enslaved, and since Roman armies conquered quite a lot of places, there was rarely a shortage of people forced into this system. You could find slaves from Gaul, Greece, Syria, Egypt, and many other regions scattered across the empire. The Roman world was incredibly diverse. Languages, cultures, traditions, all mixing together inside the massive machinery of the empire. Sometimes peacefully, sometimes less peacefully. Now, here's something interesting. Not all Roman slaves lived the same kind of life. Some had extremely harsh conditions, especially those working in mines or large agricultural estates. Mining, in particular, was brutal. Dangerous tunnels, poor air, long hours, very little hope of escape. It was one of the worst jobs imaginable in the ancient world. Even Roman writers admitted that life in the mines was grim, which is historian language for absolutely terrible. But other slaves had very different experiences. Household slaves in wealthy families sometimes lived relatively stable lives. They cooked meals, cleaned rooms, managed accounts, tutored children. In fact, many educated Greeks ended up working as tutors for Roman aristocratic families, which must have been an interesting cultural exchange. Imagine being a philosopher from Athens, now teaching Latin grammar to a slightly bored Roman teenager who would rather be watching chariot races. History has a lot of moments like that. Some slaves even held positions of trust. They managed businesses, handled finances, organized estates, and over time, many slaves were eventually freed. This process was called manumission. Once freed, the former slave became what Romans called a freedman. Freedmen were not quite equal to citizens born free, but they still gained many legal rights. They could own property, run businesses, earn money, and sometimes become very wealthy. In fact, several extremely successful Roman businessmen started life as slaves. The social ladder in Rome was surprisingly flexible, at least compared to some other ancient societies, though it was still far from fair. Freedmen often remained connected to their former masters, sort of like a long-term social contract. The former slave would show loyalty and respect. The former master might provide support or business opportunities. It was a relationship built on obligation and sometimes genuine affection. Human relationships have always been complicated like that. If we wander through the streets of Pompeii, we can actually see evidence of freedmen rising in society. Many houses in Pompeii belonged to freedmen who became wealthy merchants. Some decorated their homes with lavish artwork and mosaics. One famous house contains a mosaic showing the Battle of Issus, featuring Alexander the Great charging dramatically into battle, which is a bold decorative choice. Imagine inviting guests over for dinner and casually displaying a massive mosaic of ancient warfare on your floor. Roman interior design was confident. Now, above freedmen in the social ladder were ordinary Roman citizens. These were the people who could vote, participate in civic life, and proudly claim membership in the Roman state. Citizenship was extremely valuable. It provided legal protections and social status, and over time, more and more people across the empire received it. Eventually, in the year 212 AD, the Emperor Caracalla issued a decree granting Roman citizenship to almost all free inhabitants of the empire. Why did he do this? Well, historians suspect taxes played a role. More citizens meant more people eligible for certain taxes, which is a classic government strategy. Ancient or modern, some things never change. Above ordinary citizens stood the wealthy elite. These were the senators and aristocrats who dominated Roman politics. Families with long histories, ancient names, and extremely strong opinions about their own importance. Roman aristocrats loved tradition. They loved ancestors. They loved reminding everyone exactly how prestigious their family was. Sometimes this involved displaying wax masks of deceased relatives in their homes. Yes, wax masks. Imagine walking through a hallway lined with eerily lifelike faces of your ancestors staring silently from the walls. Apparently, this was meant to inspire pride, though it might also inspire the occasional nightmare. The most powerful members of the aristocracy served in the Roman Senate. The Senate had existed since the days of the Roman Republic. Under the emperors, its political power was reduced somewhat, but it still carried enormous prestige. Senators debated laws, advised emperors, and occasionally complained about everything, which is basically what legislative bodies have done throughout history. Roman senators were also expected to behave with dignity and virtue, at least in theory. In practice, some of them were extremely dramatic. Feuds between aristocratic families could last generations. Political rivalries were intense, and public speeches sometimes turned into long theatrical performances. Roman politics had a flair for drama. And of course, above everyone else sat the emperor, the ultimate authority of the Roman Empire. Now, emperors varied widely in personality. Some were brilliant administrators, some were military geniuses, and others, well, others probably should not have been allowed near the imperial throne. But we'll get to those characters later, very slowly, because tonight we're not rushing through history, we're drifting through it. Let's imagine one more quiet scene before we move on. It's late evening in Rome. The city is calmer now. A few taverns still glow with lamplight. The distant rumble of carts echoes through the streets. Somewhere, a family is finishing dinner. Elsewhere, a slave is sweeping the floor of a courtyard. A group of young Romans walks home after watching chariot races earlier that day. And above it all, the massive monuments of the city stand quietly in the night. Temples, forums, statues of emperors staring proudly into the darkness. Rome was a place of enormous ambition, a city convinced of its own importance, and honestly, it wasn't entirely wrong. For centuries, this city shaped the lives of millions across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, all connected by roads, laws, trade, and the complicated rhythms of daily life. But in the next part, we'll float toward another important aspect of Roman culture: entertainment. Because Romans loved being entertained, and when Romans decided to entertain themselves, they rarely did things halfway. Instead, they built enormous venues, filled them with tens of thousands of spectators, and turned leisure into a massive public event. You might say the empire ran partly on bread and a lot of spectacle. In fact, the Roman poet Juvenal once complained that the Roman public had, which sounds dramatic, but he wasn't entirely wrong. Let's start with one of the most famous buildings ever constructed, the massive amphitheater known today as the Colosseum. Even if someone knows very little about Roman history, they've probably seen pictures of this place. And honestly, the scale of it is still impressive even now. The Colosseum could hold somewhere around 50,000 spectators, possibly more. Rows upon rows of stone seating rising high above the arena floor. Entrances carefully designed so enormous crowds could enter and exit surprisingly quickly. Roman engineers were very good at moving people efficiently, especially when those people were excited about a day of entertainment. Construction of the Colosseum began under the Emperor Vespasian in the 1st century AD. His son Titus later completed it and opened the arena with games that reportedly lasted 100 days. 100 days, which is quite a grand opening. Imagine attending a stadium event that runs continuously for over 3 months. Even modern sports leagues would find that exhausting. So, what exactly did people watch inside the Colosseum? Well, several different types of spectacles. The most famous were gladiator fights. Gladiators were trained fighters who battled each other in front of roaring crowds. Some were slaves, some were prisoners of war, and some were volunteers hoping to earn fame and money. Yes, people occasionally chose this career path, because if you survived long enough and fought well, gladiators could become celebrities. Ancient Rome had its own version of sports stars, though admittedly with slightly sharper equipment involved. Now, despite what movies sometimes show, gladiator fights weren't always chaotic bloodbaths. Many matches were carefully organized sporting contests. Gladiators trained extensively in special schools called ludi. They practiced techniques, learned different fighting styles, and developed reputations with fans. Some gladiators even had devoted followings. Fans would cheer their favorite fighters, argue about their skills, and probably complain about refereeing decisions. Human nature hasn't changed that much. Put 2 competitors in front of a crowd, and people will immediately start forming opinions. Different types of gladiators used different equipment. Some carried large shields and short swords. Others fought with nets and tridents. Each style had its own strengths and weaknesses. and spectators quickly learned to recognize these differences. Watching gladiator matches became a kind of tactical sport for the audience. People debated strategies, predicted outcomes, and occasionally shouted very enthusiastic advice from the stands, which the fighters on the arena floor probably ignored completely. Of course, gladiators weren't the only entertainment in the Colosseum. There were also elaborate animal hunts. Exotic animals from across the empire were brought to Rome for these spectacles. Lions from Africa, bears from Europe, leopards, elephants, even the occasional rhinoceros. Roman audiences were fascinated by strange animals from distant lands. For many spectators, this was the first and only time they would ever see such creatures. The empire was enormous, but travel was still slow and difficult. So bringing animals to the capital created a kind of living display of imperial power. Look how vast our empire is, the games seemed to say. We can bring animals from the ends of the earth to entertain you. Sometimes the spectacles became incredibly elaborate. Arena floors could be decorated with artificial landscapes, props, hidden trapdoors, complex stage machinery. In some early events, parts of the arena were even flooded to stage mock naval battles, though historians still debate exactly how often this happened, because turning a giant amphitheater into a temporary lake is logistically ambitious, even by Roman standards. But if the Colosseum represented dramatic spectacles, there was another type of entertainment that Romans loved even more: chariot racing. We mentioned it earlier when we visited the Circus Maximus, and honestly, for many Romans, chariot racing was the ultimate sport. The Circus Maximus was enormous, stretching through a long valley between two hills of Rome, capable of holding well over 100,000 spectators, possibly closer to 200,000 during major events. That's an enormous crowd. Even modern stadiums rarely hold that many people. The races themselves were fast, dangerous, and wildly exciting. Teams of horses pulled lightweight chariots around a long oval track. Drivers leaned dangerously as they sped through tight corners. Crashes were common. Spectators loved it. Every race lasted only a few minutes, but the tension built quickly. And when accidents happened, the crowd reacted instantly. Gasps, shouts, wild cheering from rival factions. It was chaos in the most Roman way possible. Fans supported different racing teams with almost tribal loyalty: the blues, the greens, the reds, the whites. People wore team colors, argued endlessly about which drivers were best, and occasionally caused riots when rival supporters got a little too enthusiastic. Historians studying later Roman and Byzantine cities have recorded full-scale disturbances sparked by racing rivalries, all because one group of horses happened to run slightly faster than another. Sports fandom has always been powerful. Now, not all Roman entertainment was loud and dramatic. There were also theaters, public performances of plays, poetry readings, and musical shows. Theaters were popular gathering places for citizens who enjoyed storytelling and performance. Many Roman plays were adapted from earlier Greek works. The Romans admired Greek culture deeply. Sometimes they even borrowed entire plots, occasionally with only minor adjustments. You might call it ancient intellectual recycling. One of the famous theater complexes in Rome was the Theater of Pompey, built by the general Pompey the Great during the final years of the Roman Republic. This theater could hold tens of thousands of spectators. It also included gardens and meeting spaces, making it both a cultural center and a political gathering place. In fact, something very famous happened nearby, though we'll keep it calm tonight. Let's just say Roman politics sometimes spilled into very dramatic moments. History has a habit of doing that. As evening settles again over Rome, the crowds slowly leave the arenas. Spectators walk home discussing the day's events, debating which gladiator fought best, complaining about chariot drivers who took corners too aggressively, or praising a particularly clever theatrical performance. Entertainment gave Romans a shared experience, something to talk about, something to look forward to, a break from daily routines. and emperors understood this very well. Funding games and spectacles made rulers extremely popular, which meant many emperors sponsored huge festivals whenever they wanted public approval. Political strategy disguised as entertainment, a technique that has survived surprisingly well through the centuries. The lamps begin to flicker again along the streets. Taverns grow quieter. Most people head home, and the giant monuments of the city once again stand silent beneath the night sky. But the story of Roman life is far from finished, because next we'll drift into the strange and complicated world of Roman religion, gods, temples, omens, and an entire universe of rituals that Romans believed helped keep the empire running smoothly.